I was looking for a warranty receipt when I found the folder. That's the simplest way to explain it. Although even now that sentence feels too small for what actually happened, because people expect life-changing discoveries to arrive dramatically through a text message on a lock screen or lipstick on a collar or some unmistakable sign that something is wrong. But mine arrived at 8:43 p.m. on a Tuesday in October while I was sitting at the kitchen counter trying to find paperwork for a dishwasher that had stopped draining. The folder was sitting in our shared Google Drive between Property Taxes 2022 and Vacation Photos. Nothing about it looked unusual except the name. Keep her calm. 5 words. No password protection, no hidden location, no attempt to disguise it. Just keep her calm. I remember staring at it for several seconds because my first thought wasn't suspicion. My first thought was that it had to be something work-related. Maybe a joke. Maybe notes for a surprise. Maybe anything except what it was. I clicked. There were 86 screenshots. 86. The oldest was 19 months earlier. The newest had been added 3 days before. For a few seconds, I couldn't understand what I was seeing because the screenshots looked ordinary. Text messages, calendar entries, notes. Fragments of conversations. Things I had said. Things I had written. Moments I barely remembered. I opened the first image. It was a screenshot of a text I had sent my husband, Ryan, after he forgot dinner with my parents for the 2nd year in a row. The screenshot wasn't what made my stomach drop. The caption underneath it did. She's emotional about family events. Remind her how stressed work has been. I stared at those words. Then I opened another. A note from 14 months earlier. Underneath was another caption. If she brings this up again, mention everything we did during Christmas. Another. If she's upset, redirect to intentions. Another. Stay calm. She usually drops it after 10 minutes. I stopped clicking. Not because I had seen enough. Because suddenly I was afraid of what the 82 remaining screenshots might say, and as I sat there with the dishwasher humming behind me and Ryan upstairs in his home office finishing what he called just one last email, I found myself looking at that folder and wondering why a man who loved me needed a strategy guide for conversations with his wife. And the longer I stared at the screen, the more I remembered something he had said 3 weeks earlier when we were arguing about the weekend trip he had promised to plan. He had smiled. Not sarcastically, not cruelly, just calmly. Ryan was always calm. That was one of the things people loved most about him. While I was expressive, he was measured. While I talked things through, he listened. At least that was the story everyone believed, including me for a very long time. The thing about Ryan was that he never raised his voice, never slammed a door, never called me names. If you had met him, you would have liked him immediately. Most people did, especially because I was the one who usually looked frustrated by the end of our disagreements. I was the one speaking faster. I was the one trying to explain why something mattered. I was the one who occasionally cried. Ryan would simply sit there looking patient, reasonable, understanding. And somehow I would leave those conversations feeling guilty for bringing the issue up in the first place. 3 weeks before I found the folder, we had been sitting on our back patio in Denver discussing a weekend getaway that had never happened. Again, the trip had been his idea. He had suggested it in May. We were having it in June, then July, then August. By September, it still wasn't booked. Every time I asked about it, he said he would handle it. Every time I believed him. Finally, on September 18th at exactly 7:22 p.m., after the 4th canceled weekend, I told him I was disappointed. Not angry. Not accusing. And Ryan had looked at me with that calm expression and said, I think sometimes you focus so much on what didn't happen that you miss everything that did. I remember immediately feeling ashamed, as if I had failed some test I didn't know I was taking. The conversation ended 10 minutes later. I apologized for being disappointed. Now, sitting in front of 86 screenshots, I suddenly wondered if that conversation was in the folder too. I clicked image number 23. It was. The screenshot showed a note. 1 sentence. Shift discussion from unmet expectation to overall appreciation. I read it 3 times, then a 4th, because I knew exactly what it meant. The words weren't complicated. What complicated them was realizing they had worked, over and over, for years. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. Not because I was shocked, because something stranger was happening. I was remembering, not one moment, dozens, tiny moments I had dismissed, tiny moments that suddenly seemed connected. And to understand why that folder unsettled me so deeply, you need to understand who I was before Ryan, before the house, before the shared calendars and grocery lists and carefully managed conversations, back when I was 28 years old and absolutely certain that I knew who I was. At 28, I was a marketing manager for a regional outdoor apparel company in Denver, and I loved my job with the kind of enthusiasm that made people roll their eyes a little because I genuinely looked forward to Monday mornings, which sounds ridiculous now, but it's true. I was ambitious, not in a ruthless way, just focused. I had color-coded project plans, ambitious quarterly goals, and a 5-year career roadmap saved in a Notes app folder called Future Megan. There were 41 entries in that folder. 41. I know because I counted them years later. Some were small goals, some were huge. One was an application for a leadership development program in Seattle. Another was a plan to start a consulting business before I turned 40. I wasn't fearless. I was simply accustomed to having opinions. If I wanted something, I said it. If something bothered me, I addressed it. My younger sister Emily used to joke that I could negotiate with a parking meter, and honestly, she wasn't entirely wrong. Then I met Ryan at a friend's 4th of July barbecue. He was standing near a cooler explaining the rules of a card game to 3 people who looked completely confused, and somehow he managed to do it without sounding impatient. That was Ryan's gift. People felt comfortable around him, seen around him. He asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He remembered details. He followed up. When I mentioned during our second date that my grandmother had surgery scheduled for August 12th, he texted me on August 13th to ask how she was recovering. Most people don't remember things like that. Ryan did, at least in the beginning. beginning, the relationship moved steadily. Not quickly, steadily. By the time we moved into our first apartment together 18 months later, everyone in my life approved of him. My parents loved him. Emily loved him. My friends loved him. And I loved the version of myself I seemed to be becoming with him. More patient, more flexible, more collaborative. At least that's how I described it then. The first moment that felt strange happened 7 months into our relationship. It was so small I almost didn't mention it even to myself. We were meeting friends for dinner downtown. I had chosen a blue dress I loved. Nothing dramatic, just a dress that made me feel confident. When I came downstairs, Ryan smiled and said, "You look great." Although the black one is probably a little more flattering, that was it. One sentence. One harmless sentence. I laughed, changed clothes, and forgot about it. Or at least I thought I forgot about it. But months later, when I reached for that blue dress again, I found myself hesitating in front of the closet because somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet voice had already begun asking a question that would follow me for years. What if he's right? And that question turned out to be much more dangerous than I understood at the time. Because once you start asking yourself what if he's right, you start asking it about everything. Not immediately, not dramatically, just little by little. A suggestion here, a comment there, a tiny adjustment that feels so reasonable you barely notice you've made it. A few months after the dress incident, I was interviewing for a senior marketing position at another company. The salary increase was $27,000. The role came with more responsibility, a larger team, and a direct path into executive leadership. I was excited. Terrified, but excited. The night before my second interview, Ryan and I were eating takeout Thai food at our kitchen table when I told him I thought I had a real shot. He smiled. Then he said, "I just hope you're not chasing a title that will make you miserable." Again, not cruel, not insulting, just concerned, reasonable, caring. At least that's how it sounded. I spent the rest of dinner defending a job I hadn't even been offered yet, explaining why I wanted it, explaining why I thought I could handle it, explaining why ambition wasn't the same thing as greed. 2 weeks later, when they offered me the position, I turned it down. I told everyone I wanted better work-life balance. What I didn't tell them was that Ryan's voice had quietly followed me through every stage of the decision. I thought I was choosing. I didn't realize I was absorbing. Around the same time, another pattern began. Whenever something went wrong, I became responsible for fixing it. Not because Ryan demanded it. That would have been obvious. Instead, he became helpless in ways that seemed almost charming. If the internet bill was overdue, he forgot. If a family birthday gift needed ordering, he forgot. If dinner reservations had to be made, he forgot. If someone needed to call a contractor, a plumber, a roofer, a mechanic, he forgot. Ryan forgot a remarkable number of things. And because I was organized, I remembered. Because I remembered, I handled them. Because I handled them, he stopped trying. The process was so gradual, I never saw it happening. By our 4th year together, I was managing nearly every invisible task in our lives. His mother's birthday, his dentist appointments, holiday travel, home maintenance schedules, insurance renewals, Christmas shopping, vacation planning, thank you cards, anniversary reservations, everything. Whenever I felt overwhelmed and brought it up, Ryan would wrap an arm around me and say the same sentence. "You're just better at that stuff than I am." I used to hear that as a compliment. You're just better at that stuff. You're just better at that stuff. For years, I heard it as appreciation. What I didn't realize was that appreciation without participation eventually starts to feel a lot like abandonment. And by the time I began noticing how exhausted I was becoming, I had already spent thousands of days carrying responsibilities that weren't technically mine, but somehow always ended up in my hands. The strange thing is that from the outside, our life looked incredibly normal. Good even. We bought a 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood where people decorated for every holiday and waved while walking their dogs. We hosted game nights. We attended weddings. We took photos and matching sweaters at Christmas. If you scrolled through my social media, you would have seen exactly what I saw for a long time. A stable marriage, a dependable husband, a woman who seemed lucky. What you wouldn't have seen were the spreadsheets in my head, the mental lists, the constant calculations, the invisible work. At 6:14 a.m., I was remembering Ryan's annual physical appointment. At 12:23 p.m., I was ordering a birthday gift for his nephew. At 8:47 p.m., I was checking whether we had renewed the homeowner's insurance. I carried our life everywhere. Even when I wasn't physically doing something, I was mentally holding it. And whenever I tried to explain that exhaustion, Ryan somehow made the conversation about something else. One evening, I told him I felt overwhelmed by everything I was tracking. He nodded thoughtfully. Then he said, "I think you put a lot of pressure on yourself. Not us. Myself." A subtle difference, a powerful one, because now the problem wasn't the workload. The problem was my reaction to the workload. I remember sitting there actually considering whether he was right. Maybe I was creating stress. Maybe I was overcomplicating things. Maybe everyone else managed life more easily. That became Ryan's specialty, not denying my feelings. Reframing them, redirecting them, softening them until they became difficult to trust. If I felt hurt, I was stressed. If I felt ignored, I was overwhelmed. If I felt disappointed, I was focusing on negatives. Every explanation sounded compassionate. Every explanation moved responsibility away from him. And the worst part was that I participated. I helped him do it, because Ryan never demanded silence. He simply rewarded comfort. Whenever I let something go, the evening stayed peaceful. Whenever I pushed for accountability, the conversation became exhausting. So eventually I stopped pushing. Not consciously, just gradually. The same way a person stops sitting in a chair that always pinches their back. You adapt. You adjust. You avoid. By year 7 of our marriage, I noticed something that should have frightened me. I had stopped sharing certain dreams with him, not because I was hiding them, because discussing them felt strangely discouraging. The leadership program in Seattle remained unfinished in my notes app. The consulting business plan remained unfinished. The future versions of myself remained unfinished. Every time I mentioned one of them, Ryan would ask practical questions, reasonable questions, questions that somehow left me feeling foolish for wanting more. And sitting in my kitchen at 8:58 p.m., staring at screenshot after screenshot inside a folder called Keep Her Calm, I finally began to wonder whether all those conversations had unfolded exactly the way Ryan wanted them to, because as I opened image number 37, I found a note attached to a conversation about my Seattle application that made my chest tighten so hard I almost couldn't breathe. The note said, "Ask about financial risks. She usually backs away when decisions feel uncertain." I stared at the screen, not moving, not blinking, just staring, because I remembered that conversation perfectly, or at least I thought I did. The application had been sitting in my drafts folder for nearly 8 months when I finally worked up the courage to mention it. The program was competitive. Only 120 people were accepted each year. The tuition reimbursement from my company would have covered most of it. I had spent weeks researching, weeks preparing, weeks convincing myself I was qualified. When I told Ryan about it, he didn't say no. That would have been obvious. Instead, he asked whether the investment made sense, whether the travel requirements might strain our marriage, whether I was underestimating the workload, whether I had considered all the risks. By the end of the conversation, I felt irresponsible for wanting it. 3 days later, I withdrew the application. Now, I was staring at proof that the outcome had been anticipated before the conversation even happened, maybe even planned. I clicked another screenshot, then another, then another. Patterns emerged everywhere. The same phrases, the same strategies, the same predictable outcomes. There was a screenshot from an argument about household responsibilities. The note underneath read, "Thank her first, then mention how much pressure she's under at work." Another, "Focus on intentions rather than actions." Another, "If conversation becomes emotional, take a break and revisit later." The problem wasn't that any of those phrases were inherently bad. A therapist might recommend some of them. A relationship book probably would. The problem was the purpose. These weren't reminders about understanding me. They were instructions for managing me, controlling the direction of the conversation, avoiding accountability, maintaining comfort. And suddenly dozens of memories began lining up beside one another like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across 10 years. The canceled trips, the abandoned applications, the forgotten responsibilities, the endless conversations that somehow ended with me apologizing. Not because I was wrong, because I was tired. At 9:11 p.m., I heard footsteps upstairs. Ryan, moving around his office, closing drawers, finishing his workday. For a brief moment, I considered confronting him immediately, holding up the folder, demanding an explanation. But something stopped me. Not fear, clarity. For the first time in years, I didn't want another conversation. I didn't want another explanation. I didn't want another carefully managed discussion that left me questioning my own conclusions. I wanted evidence. I wanted understanding. I wanted to see the entire picture before he had a chance to explain it away. So I kept reading image 48, image 52, image 61. Then I reached image 74.
And that's where I found the detail that changed everything. Not because it was the cruelest note, not because it was the most shocking, because it revealed something much larger than a communication strategy, something that explained the previous 10 years in a way I had never considered before. The screenshot wasn't a text message. It wasn't a note. It was a spreadsheet. And at the very top of one column was a single word, manage.
Just one word. The spreadsheet contained 312 rows. Dates, tasks, names, assignments. At first I thought it was some kind of household planning document. We both like staying organized, and for a second I almost felt relieved. Then I looked closer. Every row represented a responsibility. Schedule HVAC inspection, Megan. Order anniversary gift, Megan. Book Thanksgiving flights, Megan. Call insurance company, Megan. Buy gift for mom, Megan. Renew vehicle registration, Megan. The rows kept going and going. Occasionally Ryan's name appeared. Replace air filter, pick up dry cleaning, mow lawn. Small isolated tasks, one-time tasks. Meanwhile, my name was attached to nearly everything that required remembering, planning, anticipating, coordinating, or caring. I scrolled to the bottom. 312 entries. 312. My hands actually started shaking. Not because the division was unfair. I already knew it was unfair. The spreadsheet proved something worse. Ryan knew it too. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't me simply being better at that stuff. Someone had documented the workload. Someone had seen the imbalance. Someone had watched it grow. And instead of fixing it, he had maintained it. I felt something inside me shift, not explode. Shift, like a lock quietly turning. For years, I had been trying to solve a problem I couldn't fully see. Now I could see it. Every birthday reminder, every appointment, every holiday, every invisible responsibility. I wasn't carrying them because nobody noticed. I was carrying them because somebody noticed and decided it was easier if I kept carrying them. Upstairs, I heard Ryan laugh at something on a video call. A normal sound, an ordinary sound. And somehow that made everything hurt more. Because while he was laughing, I was sitting at our kitchen table realizing that the life I had spent 10 years managing wasn't just exhausting. It had been carefully arranged to stay that way. Then my eyes landed on one final entry near the bottom of the spreadsheet, and for the first time that night, I stopped breathing. The entry was dated 17 days earlier, September 28th. The task description read, Leadership Program Follow-up. Next to it was my name. Not Ryan's, mine. Under the notes section were 6 words. Interest appears reduced. No action needed. I stared at those words until they blurred, because the leadership program wasn't a household task. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't a birthday reminder. It was my future, my dream. and somehow it had ended up on a spreadsheet alongside oil changes and insurance renewals. That was the moment everything became painfully simple. Ryan hadn't just been managing conversations, he had been managing outcomes. Not through threats, not through control, not through obvious manipulation. Through influence. Tiny influences, hundreds of them. Each one small enough to ignore, together large enough to reshape a life. At 9:37 p.m., I closed my laptop, walked upstairs, past Ryan's office, past our bedroom, and sat on the bathroom floor, fully clothed. The tile was cold. The room was quiet. For the first time all evening, I stopped gathering evidence, stopped analyzing, stopped explaining. I just sat there. 10 years. 10 years of making myself smaller in ways I never noticed. 10 years of second-guessing instincts that had once been strong. 10 years of asking for less. The tears came quietly, not dramatic sobs, just tears. The kind that arrive when you're finally too tired to keep defending something that isn't true. I cried for the Seattle program. I cried for the woman who used to fill notebooks with plans. I cried for every time I apologized for wanting more. And sometime after 11 p.m., when there were no tears left, I looked at my reflection in the mirror. My face was red. My eyes were swollen. But for the first time in years, I trusted myself completely. I knew what I had seen. I knew what it meant. And I knew the next thing I did couldn't involve asking Ryan for permission to understand my own life. So I stood up, washed my face, picked up my phone, and opened a folder in my notes app that I hadn't touched in almost 3 years. The folder was called Future Megan. 41 entries, just like before. I sat on the edge of the bed and started reading. The consulting business plan, the leadership goals, the cities I wanted to visit, the certifications I wanted to earn. Page after page of plans written by a woman who believed her life was still expanding. By midnight, I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't thinking about winning an argument. I was thinking about recovery. The next morning, I called in sick to work. For the first time in 6 years. Then I did something small, very small. I created a spreadsheet of my own, not to manage Ryan, to document reality. Every responsibility, every appointment, every recurring task. By 2 p.m., there were 287 active responsibilities listed. 221 belonged to me. 34 belonged to Ryan. The rest were shared. I printed it, saved copies, and opened the draft application for the leadership program. The program itself was no longer available, but the company that ran it offered another executive course starting in January. The deadline was Friday. I filled out every page, attached every document, submitted it at 4:16 p.m. Then I called Emily. My sister listened for 43 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she said something that stayed with me. "Megan, you don't sound confused anymore." She was right. For years I had been confused. Now I wasn't. That evening, Ryan came home expecting an ordinary Thursday. Instead, I handed him a printed copy of both spreadsheets, his and mine. Then I told him I wasn't interested in debating them. I wasn't interested in explanations. I wasn't interested in intentions. Only facts. For the first time in our entire relationship, I left the room before he could respond. And as I walked away, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not certainty, not happiness. Freedom. Just a small amount, but enough to take the next step, because 3 weeks later, an email arrived in my inbox at exactly 8:02 a.m., and when I opened it, the first sentence changed the direction of my life. "Congratulations, we are pleased to offer you a place in the January Executive Leadership Cohort." I read the email twice, then a third time. Not because I didn't understand it, because for so many years I had trained myself to look for reasons something wouldn't work. Reasons to wait, reasons to be practical, reasons to stay exactly where I was. And for the first time, I didn't. I accepted the offer before lunch. The months that followed weren't dramatic. There was no movie ending, no perfect speech, no instant transformation, just a series of choices, small ones, honest ones. The kind that slowly return a person to herself. Some relationships survived those choices, some didn't. Not everything was fixable. Not everything was supposed to be. By spring, I was spending weekends studying again, planning again, setting goals again. Emily told me my laugh sounded different, lighter. I think she was right. Then one evening in May, almost 7 months after I found the folder, I opened my notes app and found the old entry about starting a consulting business before I turned 40. I smiled, not because I had achieved it, because I wanted it again. The desire was back. The ambition was back. I was back. At 10:14 p.m., I opened my laptop at the kitchen table. Not the old kitchen, a different one, a smaller one, a quieter one. Rain tapped softly against the window while I created a new business plan document. The cursor blinked on a blank page, waiting. For a moment, I thought about the folder, the screenshots, the spreadsheets, the years I spent becoming smaller. Then I thought about the woman who had written 41 plans for her future and believed she was capable of every one of them. My fingers settled on the keyboard. I typed the first sentence, saved the file, and for the first time in a very long time, the future wasn't something I was managing for someone else. It belonged to me.